What is happening, everybody? All right, so this is part 2 of my 2-video series about modifying your Hellcat. The first video basically took you through everything that is a simple minor bolt-on up to a tune. So in this video, I want to talk about a bit more involved and in-depth modifications and what you can expect out of those. The big thing is this. The idea, once you start getting past the tune and a couple of minor bolt-ons, is you've got to know that now we are talking about every modification that will absolutely void your warranty. So this is a situation where these modifications are not for the faint of heart and not for the shy of wallet either. These are going to be the more expensive modifications, the more labor-intensive modifications to your Hellcat. So let's get into those. First of all, let's talk about some of the minor modifications that fall under this category, but are still considered fairly major just in terms of the amount of work needed. First and foremost would be some type of intercooler enhancement, basically larger heat exchangers. These are a bit more involved. They do require the removal of your front clip and are modifications that most car guys probably won't find themselves jumping square into the middle of. But that being said, they do work, especially if you're doing any road courses, auto course work, things like that. You're going to want to look into modifications like that to keep those temperatures down if you don't want to go with a product like a killer chiller, which utilizes the car's stock air conditioning system to chill that supercharger coolant down. The difference between the two systems is the killer chiller is really more for drag racing. It's not for autocross or open track events where you're going to be on the gas, off the gas, or really putting a lot of power through the car for a long period of time. Killer chiller just won't be able to keep up with it. That's where the larger heat exchanger does a good job. So just know the limitations of both of those going into them. Now, and by the way, in terms of horsepower, no horsepower gain per se, although the killer chiller will work very well in terms of making your car considerably more consistent at the drag strip. Again, no power gain, but consistency is extremely important for a lot of guys. Secondly, there is a product called Active Inner Chiller, I believe, that is also in the same realm as cooling your supercharger fluid. In this case, they make some spacers for your supercharger. How well do they work? Well, I'm going to say they're just the other side of being a gimmick. It's basically a Flonic spacer, keeps the engine heat more or less for transferring into your supercharger itself. You'll see a fairly decent drop in temperature on the supercharger. Now, does that matter in the real world? Probably not really all that much, but the reality is that it does cool off the supercharger a little bit, keeps it from getting heat soaked as much, so there is some gain there, I guess, with that. Would I recommend them? Sure, why not? It's a harmless modification and it certainly can't hurt. The only difference is that it does require the removal of the supercharger to install them, and again, that requires making sure that you stick to a very strict torque sequence with an accurate torque wrench. Again, not for the faint of heart. You need to make sure you're taking that to a professional performance shop to be done. Now, if we're talking about these types of modifications, we've already talked about a tune prior to this video. Just assume that any of these other modifications will require a tune. So, first thing first. Let's get a couple of things out of the way when we're talking horsepower numbers. Again, we are talking about Mustang dyno numbers. If you need a correction factor for DynoJet, just throw another 10%. You'll be in the ballpark. Very close, as a matter of fact. But the main thing to remember is once you start throwing pulleys at these cars, you've got to understand that you're throwing more power at a car that's already heavy by any measure. Yeah, remember, these cars are going to be sitting at least 4,300 pounds just sitting by itself. throw a driver in that thing, you're looking at around 4,500 pounds going down the drag strip, and trying to get that much power moving means that you're going to be putting existing driveline parts under a significant amount of stress. Believe me when I tell you, you will start to find weak links very quickly. So what do you need first and foremost to get installed on the car before you start throwing more power at it? I suggest throwing a set of upgraded half shafts into these things. Believe me when I tell you, that is going to be one of the most annoying expenditures you will have, because you don't pick up any power, but you are picking up durability. It's not sexy. It does represent a significant chunk of change, but if you're going to throw a ton of power at the car, you've got to give it the parts that it needs, or you're going to have a failure. And again, this is already assuming all the mods that were done to the car in the video that I did previous to this, the first video, part 1, those are done to the car. So drive shaft, again, you're possibly a diff brace. One other thing I wanted to talk about too, speaking of driveline parts, rear diffs. Once you start getting past, say, the 750, 800 horsepower to the rear wheels range with these cars, you're going to probably want to stick with your stock differential for 2 reasons. One, the stock differential is just a little bit stronger than the 309, which is an upgrade, or the upgrade that guys will use. Secondly, basically getting the car to launch is a little bit easier with that 2.62 that is the stock ratio. There are plenty of guys, though, that love the 309. It does make the car a bit more lively on the street. Just know that the 309 rear gear will significantly change how your tuner tunes your transmission. It can basically give your tuner a little bit of a fit initially. It's not anything that you can't overcome, but it is something that your tuner is going to have to focus on in getting your car to complete your 1-2 and your 2-3 shift properly with that 309 gear. Again, especially once you start throwing quite a bit of power at it. So let's start talking about pulleys, because that's what everybody wants to hear about. I'm going to break this down into 2 different categories, 93 octane and E85. I'm really not going to talk too much about race gas. If I'm talking about E85, assume that I'm talking about race gas, but the race gas tunes and the way that race gas works with these cars, again, E85 is just going to be the way that I'm going to be discussing the alternate fuels. It's basically the same race gas to E85. There's typically a power drop going from E85 to race gas, but again, I don't want to get too mired in with that, because I understand that there's guys that don't have access to quality E85, but do have access to quality, Sunoco 104 or VP MS 109. These types of fuels that you can get at your local drag strip fairly easily. Again, not going to make quite the same amount of power as E85, but you'll be in the same ballpark. So, if you're going to keep your car more or less stock, and you're going to run it on 93 octane, the smallest pulley, and this is the upper pulley, that I would recommend would be a 285. The 285 is going to get you about 3.5 pounds of boost extra. Well, what does that translate into power? Well, you're looking at somewhere around 60 to 65 horsepower to the rear wheels with that pulley. You're going to be somewhere around and this is, again, you've got a tune already in the car, or assuming the tune as well will be adding power, but you're going to be somewhere in like that 680, 670 horsepower to the rear wheels range. That is a safe place to be. In fact, 285 might even get you as high as 690 to the rear wheels. 295 is more like 670. I recommend a 295 upper pulley, but you can get away with a 285, depending on the elevation that you live in. If you're close to sea level, I don't recommend going more aggressive than a 295. The reason for that is when the density altitude, when you live close to sea level, drops below say 0, you start getting into mine shaft air, so to speak, where the density altitude is negative, that's when these cars start to really show some weaknesses, especially if that tune is a little bit too aggressive. Let's say the car was tuned during the summertime. The tuner throws a little bit extra timing at it, maybe throws a little bit extra fuel at it, trying to eke a number out of the thing on the dyno. Well, when the temperature drops, the air becomes more dense, you will physically be making more boost. And although that sounds like a great thing, it's really not if the tune can't accommodate it, or more importantly, if your fuel quality cannot accommodate it. So you're going to have to take that into account when you are putting your combination together. Again, if you live in altitudes that are above, say, 1,500 feet, that's where you live, and so your DA on what would be a corrected 0 density altitude day would be 1,500, you'll be fairly safe with that 285. Again, 295 if you live in altitudes that are significantly lower than that. And that will keep you safe on 93 octane. I would also recommend, if you're going to stay with 93 octane, pinning your crank. And what that means is you're basically locking your lower supercharger pulley to the crankshaft. Right now it's basically a press fit with a lot of torque on the snout of that thing to hold that pulley in place. It's not very common to spin a crank pulley with a stock supercharger pulley ratio, but you can in some cases find some issues with the vehicle if you don't pin that lower crank once you start putting smaller pulleys on the car and you're spinning that supercharger harder. And if 93 octane is not going to be good enough for you, then you can go with more aggressive pulleys. You can go with a 10% overdrive crank pulley, and you could go with perhaps a 295 or a 285 upper pulley. If you're going to do that, just keep in mind that you will be running E85 or race gas in that car, or two separate tunes, one for 93 and one for race gas E85 at all times. Reason for that is you simply can't make enough power with, you simply can't make enough of a safety margin at the power levels that 93 octane will accommodate. It just doesn't work like that, especially with the mass that these cars have to try to get propelled down a drag strip. It simply doesn't work that way. So again, if you're going to start going with pulley ratios with a 10% lower and a 285, a 275, which is my favorite combination for these cars on E85, then you are going to start looking at fuel system upgrades. Innovators West makes a fantastic twin pump setup that is basically a plug and play for the Hellcat. And if that pulley ratio is what you're gunning for, that 10% lower and 275 upper, I highly recommend that bit of kit to make the car work. Now, as far as injectors, because you will be going with E85 at this point, I recommend fuel injector connection 127-pound injectors. They are very good, and they are a known data point for Pike's performance. And again, that's the injectors that he likes to go with, because they are very good injectors with very strong data points that the combination just works. And in terms of how much power do you get out of that combination? Well, with the stock manifolds, no catalytic converters on E85, with, in essence, just a set of fuel pumps, pulleys, and some injectors, you're looking at about 800 horsepower to the rear wheels. And on a drag racing wheel and tire setup, like I have on my car, you're looking at your garden variety 980, 970 car in the quarter mile if you live in areas where your altitude's basically below 1,000 feet. So if 9s isn't fast enough for you for one of these cars, how much more can you do to it, or what else can you do to the car to really wake it up? Well, this is where things get a little bit foggy for me. I don't like recommending attempting to put one of these cars much quicker than, say, 920, 930, 940. More aggressive pulley ratios just mean that you're putting a significant amount of stress on that supercharger, and you're really running the risk of doing some damage to that supercharger. And if something lets go in the supercharger, it could potentially blow your motor sky high if you start getting bits and pieces past that intercooler. I doubt very seriously that you're going to want to be the guy that frags a supercharger and then possibly lunches his engine. So, nitrous oxide is an idea that you can roll with. Plenty of guys have done it and have gotten their cars low 9-second range without having any real issues with durability. You can go with an aftermarket supercharger, and in that respect, you've got Kenny Bell with their Mammoth supercharger. You've got Whipple with their supercharger lines as well. You can get more power out of the cars for sure. And again, camshafts, superchargers, triple hat 4 fuel system, all of that, along with solid tuning by a tuner that really does speak Mopar. You can easily get these things well into the 1,000 horsepower to the rear tire range, which will equate to low 9-second passes, and if you've got quite a bit of weight reduction done to the vehicle, even into the high 8s. But again, you do run into a weight limitation with these cars, and if you're going to stick with the stock supercharger and you're okay with running E85, that 10% lower with a 275 upper really is the sweet spot for these cars on E85 with a simple fuel system modification. If you want to go faster than that, you're looking at a triple hat 4, which is the name of the manufacturer, fuel system, along with potentially modified internals, camshaft, again, larger supercharger. We're talking a lot of money at that point. And keep this in mind, the durability of your drivetrain, the transmission, the rear end, all of that is at its limit at about that 800 to 850, 875 horsepower to the rear wheel range. There's really just not enough overhead at that point to accommodate either very low density altitude conditions or any more modifications much past that. You really are at the limit of what these vehicles can manage, and again, it's based around the weight. So hopefully that helps you guys out. I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. I don't want to just keep belaying the point too much farther. If you got any questions or comments, feel free to post them up in the comments below. That's a wrap on this one. Y'all have a great one. Adios.